Chapters was blamed for killing off Canada's independent bookstores. Small shops that had survived for decades closed their doors, one after another, unable to compete. And then, in the space of a single year, Chapters itself stopped existing as an independent company. At its peak, Chapters was the largest bookstore chain Canada had ever seen. Massive superstores stacked floor to ceiling with books, couches where nobody rushed you to leave, Starbucks coffee steaming next to the new releases table. Families spent entire Saturday afternoons there without buying a single thing, and nobody minded. Then in the fall of 2000, a smaller rival, one that was losing money, launched a hostile takeover. Within months, the giant was gone. How does the company blamed for destroying the competition end up swallowed by the competitor it was supposed to have already beaten? The answer says something uncomfortable about who actually wins in retail. And it isn't always the strongest one. Larry Stevenson was not a bookman by trade. He was a businessman who saw an opportunity that most people in Canadian publishing had missed entirely. The country had never had a proper book superstore, and somebody was about to build one. The pieces he needed already existed, just scattered across two separate companies. Coles had been founded back in 1940 by brothers Carl and Jack Cole, who opened their first shop in Toronto with nothing more than a modest storefront and a belief that Canadians wanted somewhere local to buy books, rather than ordering them from overseas. Smith Books carried a different lineage. It had started life as the Canadian division of the British chain W. H. Smith before Federal Industries bought it in 1989 and gave it its own name. By the mid-1990s, these were the two largest bookstore chains in the country. Competitors, technically, though neither had the scale to match what was happening in American retail. Stevenson looked south of the border and saw Barnes & Noble and Borders building enormous stores that were changing how Americans shop for books. Nothing like that existed in Canada. So he did what nobody else had attempted. He bought both Coles and Smith Books, folded them into a single company, and gave it a new name that sounded less like a store and more like an institution. Chapters. The merger closed in April of 1995. 7 months later in November, the first two Chapters superstores opened their doors. One of them in Burlington, Ontario, not far from where a much smaller rival was already quietly building her own version of the same dream. Picture that opening day. The scale alone was the first shock. Customers who had only ever known cramped mall bookshops with narrow aisles and clerks hovering nearby suddenly found themselves inside a building the size of a supermarket. Ceilings high, shelves running in long rows deep enough to get lost in. There were armchairs, there were couches, there was a coffee counter, and nobody was rushing anyone out the door for lingering over a paperback they hadn't paid for yet. For a country used to browsing quietly and buying quickly, this was something else entirely. A teenager could disappear into the graphic novel section for an entire afternoon. A retired school teacher could sit with 3 biographies stacked on her lap, reading the first chapter of each before deciding. Nobody in Canadian retail had built a space that treated reading itself, not just buying, as something worth making room for. Stevenson's belief, the one he built the whole company around, was simple. Books deserved a temple, not a transaction counter. Chapters was his answer to a country that had never been offered one before. But even as the first customers wandered those aisles for the first time, the man who founded Chapters wasn't the only person in Canada chasing this idea. A smaller, sharper competitor named Heather Raceman was already circling, and the story of what happened between them would define Canadian bookselling for the next 3 decades. By the late 1990s, Chapters was no longer just a new idea. It was Canada's biggest bookseller, full stop. What had opened as 2 experimental superstores in November of 1995 grew into a national footprint of more than 70 Chapters-branded superstores, backed by a web of over 280 smaller stores operating under the Coles and Smith Books names in malls across the country. Chapters had even absorbed Toronto's own world's biggest bookstore, and a 67,000 square foot landmark that had been a point of civic pride since 1980, folding it into the empire while letting it keep its famous name. Going to Chapters became a ritual, not an errand. For a teenager in the mid-1990s, it might mean a Friday night spent flipping through music magazines in a corner nobody policed. For a young mother, it might mean an hour with her toddler in the children's section while a stroller sat parked nearby, nobody rushing her toward the register. For a retired couple, it might mean a weekend afternoon split between the biography aisle and two coffees from the counter near the front doors. None of these people needed to buy anything to feel like the store belonged to them. That was the entire point. The holiday season brought this to its fullest expression. In December, the superstores filled with shoppers hunting for gifts they could actually hold and flip through before deciding at a time when online buying still felt unfamiliar and risky to most Canadians. Staff built towering seasonal displays, lines formed at the registers that stretched past the magazine racks. For a lot of families, a trip to Chapters in December wasn't just about finding a present. It was one of the few shopping outings of the year where browsing itself felt like part of the celebration, something closer to visiting a public square than running an errand. Employees who worked the floor during these years often describe a strange mix of pride and exhaustion. Pride because working at Chapters meant working somewhere customers genuinely loved. Regulars who came in every week, kids who considered the store a second home, seniors who treated the staff like trusted librarians. Exhaustion because the pace of growth meant new stores kept opening faster than the company could always staff and train for, and holiday seasons in particular stretched everyone thin. Still, for many who worked the registers and the shelves in these years, it felt like being part of something that mattered to the country, not just a job. Chapters also pushed hard into territory no Canadian bookstore chain had touched before. It launched its own website, chapters.ca, at a moment when most Canadian retailers had barely begun to take the internet seriously, positioning itself directly against a young American company called Amazon that was just beginning to expand beyond its home market. For a brief window, it looked like Chapters might beat Amazon to owning online bookselling in Canada before Amazon ever had the chance to arrive. What made all of this work, more than the size of the stores or the reach of the brand, was something harder to put a number on. For the first time, an ordinary Canadian family could walk into a bookstore the way earlier generations walked into a public library, with time, with no pressure, with permission to simply be there. A single mother could bring her two kids in out of the cold and let them sit on the carpet for an hour without spending a dollar. A university student studying for exams could camp out at a cafe table with a stack of unpurchased textbooks, and nobody would ask her to leave. Nowhere else in Canadian retail offered that kind of open invitation. What was it about those wide aisles and quiet corners that made an entire country feel, for the first time, like a bookstore could be a place to belong, rather than just a place to buy? But underneath the packed aisles and the holiday crowds, the machine that had built all of this so quickly was starting to strain. The same speed that had made Chapters feel unstoppable. New stores, new formats, a rushed leap into online retail was quietly running up costs the company hadn't fully reckoned with. The golden era was real. So was the debt building up behind it. Growth like this doesn't happen by accident, and it doesn't happen for free. Behind every new Chapters superstore opening to applause was a company borrowing against its own future to make the next one happen faster. The decision to expand aggressively came directly from Stevenson and the leadership he'd built around him, including David Peterson, the former Premier of Ontario, whom Stevenson had brought on as chairman to help navigate a business landscape wary of large-scale consolidation in Canadian culture. Unlike some American retail giants that grew through independent franchise owners, Chapters expanded largely as a single corporate operation. New superstores opened under direct company ownership, one after another, across Ontario, into Quebec, out toward the Maritimes in the West. The map filled in fast. Within just a few years of that first store in Burlington, Chapters had planted its flag in every major Canadian market worth having. Speed was the entire strategy, and for a while it worked exactly as intended. Every new superstore added to the sense that Chapters wasn't just a chain anymore. It was becoming the default answer to, where do you buy books in this country? But speed came with a cost most customers never saw. Opening dozens of large-format stores in a short window meant enormous upfront spending on real estate, construction, and inventory, all before those stores had time to become profitable on their own. Chapters didn't stop at physical stores. In a move few Canadian retailers of the era would have attempted, the company took a minority stake in Pegasus, a book wholesaler meant to give Chapters more control over supply and pricing as it pushed harder into online sales through Chapters.ca. On paper, it looked like a smart vertical play: control the warehouse, control the website, control the customer relationship from end to end. In practice, Canadian publishers resisted the arrangement, wary of a single retailer gaining that much leverage over how their books reached shelves. The Pegasus venture struggled and never delivered the advantage Chapters had been counting on. By the start of 2000, the strain was becoming difficult to hide from the people who actually did business with Chapters, even if most customers walking through the doors had no idea. The company owed more than 10 million Canadian dollars to HarperCollins Canada alone, with much of that debt built up in the rush before Christmas 1999. Inventory ordered to stock shelves for the busiest shopping season of the year, purchased faster than it could be paid for. Publishers across the industry were watching closely, some quietly recalculating how much risk they were willing to carry with their biggest customer. When rumors of financial trouble started circulating in the media in late 2000, Chapters didn't stay quiet. The company pushed back hard, publicly denying that it was in any serious distress and going so far as to pursue legal action against outlets like the National Post, which it accused of spreading unsubstantiated claims about its solvency. To the public, this looked like a confident company defending its reputation. Inside the industry, among publishers and suppliers watching invoices go unpaid, it read differently. For employees on the sales floor, none of this was visible yet. Stores were still busy. Customers still lined up at the registers during the holidays. The superstores still felt, from the inside, like the biggest success story Canadian retail had produced in a generation. What nobody on the floor could see was that while Chapters was busy defending itself in the press, a much smaller competitor, one that had spent years losing money while quietly building something different, was about to make its move. By 1999, Chapters had done something no bookseller in Canadian history had managed before. It had become the default. Ask most Canadians where they bought books, and the answer wasn't a specific title or a specific need. It was simply Chapters, the way earlier generations might have said Eaton's or the Bay. At its peak, the company operated more than 70 superstores under the Chapters banner alone, supported by over 280 smaller format stores carrying the Coles and Smith Books names in malls from coast to coast. No other bookseller came close to that footprint, and none would again. The world's biggest bookstore in downtown Toronto had become something more than a store by this point. It was a landmark, a stop on the mental map of the city the way a museum or a stadium might be. And Chapters now owned it outright while wisely leaving its name untouched. Tourists photographed the exterior. Out-of-town visitors were told to go see it the way they'd be told to see the CN Tower. For a bookstore to hold that kind of civic weight in a major Canadian city was almost unheard of, and it said everything about how far Chapters had traveled from its origins as a merger of two mid-sized regional chains. What made the peak feel different from ordinary retail success was how the experience passed between generations inside the very same stores. A woman who had brought her own children to Chapters as toddlers in 1996 might, by 1999, be bringing her aging mother there instead. The three generations moving through the same aisles for entirely different reasons. The grandmother hunting for large print mysteries, the daughter for parenting guides, the grandchildren camped on the carpet with picture books. Nowhere else in Canadian retail did that kind of generational overlap happen so naturally in the same physical space, without anyone planning it that way. For employees who had been on staff since the early superstore openings, the late 1990s carried a particular kind of pride. Working the floor at a Chapters superstore in 1999 meant working somewhere that had, in the space of just 4 years, become a genuine national institution, rather than merely a successful business. Staff who had started as teenagers shelving paperbacks were now training new hires by the dozen as store after store opened. Regional managers who had once run a single mid-sized Smith Books location now oversaw superstores the size of small warehouses. The company's growth had reshaped careers as thoroughly as it had reshaped the retail landscape around it. The coffee counters mattered more to this story than they might seem to at first. Chapters had made the deliberate choice to put Starbucks inside its superstores at a time when combining a bookstore with a cafe was still a genuinely novel idea in Canada, and it changed the rhythm of how people used the space entirely. A store wasn't just somewhere you went in, found a book, and left. It became somewhere you could spend an entire Saturday. Coffee in hand, a stack of unpurchased novels on the table, no clerk hovering to ask if you needed help finding the register. That small decision, more than any marketing campaign the company ever ran, was what turned casual customers into regulars who treated the store as a second living room. None of this went unnoticed by the industry Chapters had reshaped. Independent booksellers across the country, many of them family-run operations that had served their communities for decades, watched their customer bases shrink year after year as shoppers gravitated toward the superstore's selection, comfort, and prices. Some closed outright. Others survived by specializing in what Chapters couldn't easily replicate: rare titles, deep local knowledge, a level of personal service no superstore chain could offer at scale. The resentment this created within the broader Canadian book trade would matter later, but in 1999, from inside a packed Chapters superstore on a Saturday afternoon, none of that friction was visible to the ordinary customer wandering the aisles with a coffee in hand. What was it about a company built on speed and scale that made an entire country feel for a few short years like this was simply how bookstores were always meant to be? Behind the celebration, though, a second story was accelerating in parallel. One playing out not in the aisles customers saw, but in boardrooms and supplier invoices most of them never would. The debts building since the rushed holiday season of 1999 hadn't gone away, and a smaller rival, one that had spent years losing money while Chapters dominated headlines, was about to turn that weakness into a weapon. By the time the calendar turned to 2000, the company that looked unstoppable from the sidewalk was quietly running out of room to maneuver behind closed doors. The primary crack wasn't a single dramatic event. It was arithmetic, slowly closing in. The debt load from the rushed 1999 holiday season hadn't disappeared with the new year. If anything, it had compounded. Chapters had ordered aggressively to stock shelves for what it hoped would be its biggest Christmas yet, betting that sales volume would cover the cost of the inventory once the season ended. Instead, the company found itself owing more than 10 million Canadian dollars to HarperCollins Canada alone, a debt that had piled up specifically in the run-up to that Christmas. And HarperCollins was just one publisher among many watching invoices go unpaid on schedule. Across the industry, suppliers who had once been thrilled to have Chapters as a customer were now recalculating how much risk they could absorb. Layered on top of the debt was a second, quieter problem. The Pegasus wholesaling venture that was supposed to give Chapters more control over its supply chain and its online ambitions through Chapters.ca had not delivered. Canadian publishers had resisted the arrangement from the start, wary of handing a single retailer that much leverage. And without their full cooperation, Pegasus never became the advantage Chapters needed it to be. Money and effort had gone into building infrastructure that wasn't paying its way back. And running underneath both of these problems was a rivalry that had quietly intensified for years. Indigo Books and Music, the smaller chain founded and run by Heather Reisman, had been expanding in a select market since the mid-1990s. And by the late 90s, the two companies were competing directly in cities where their stores sat close enough to feel each other's presence. Both chains discounted aggressively to win customers away from one another. Both spent heavily on marketing and store build-outs to look more appealing than the other. For customers, this rivalry meant better prices and nicer stores. For both companies' balance sheets, it meant margins getting squeezed from every direction at once, at the exact moment Chapters could least afford it. The people who saw this first weren't customers browsing the new releases table. They were the publishing sales reps and accounts receivable clerks at companies like HarperCollins, watching payment terms stretch longer than they used to, noticing that a check that should have arrived in 30 days was now taking 60 or 90. A sales rep who had built a career selling into Chapters' buying office might have started quietly wondering, sometime in early 2000, whether the company placing enormous holiday orders each November could actually keep paying for them at the pace it was growing. Nobody outside that world had any reason to suspect a thing. The stores were as busy as ever. When word of the company's financial strain finally started reaching journalists in late 2000, Chapter's response was not caution, it was defiance. The company publicly and repeatedly denied that it faced any serious financial distress, framing the reports as unfounded attacks rather than early warning signs worth examining. It went further than most companies would dare, pursuing legal action against the National Post over coverage it considered damaging and unsubstantiated. To shareholders and the public, this looked like a company standing firmly behind its own numbers. Inside the industry, among people who had actually seen the invoices, the denials read as something closer to a company that knew exactly how much trouble it was in and had decided the best strategy was to insist otherwise, loudly until the problem either resolved itself or someone else blinked first. Nobody working the floor of a Chapters superstore in the fall of 2000 experienced any of this directly. Holiday displays went up on schedule. Staff were hired for the seasonal rush, the same as every year before. From inside the store, the company felt exactly as permanent as it always had. A place customers had built entire family traditions around. A place employees had built careers inside of. A place that had reshaped what a Canadian bookstore was even supposed to look like. How long could a company this loved, this dominant, this deeply woven into the daily habits of an entire country, actually continue absorbing debt it wasn't fully able to pay down? And more troubling still, what happens to a giant like that when the smaller rival circling it has spent years losing money on purpose, waiting for exactly this kind of opening? Because by the fall of 2000, that smaller rival had seen enough. The cracks that had been invisible from the sales floor were about to become the entire story. The decision that would end Chapters as an independent company wasn't made by Chapters at all. It was made across town, inside a smaller company that had spent years losing money on purpose, and had finally decided that losing was about to become the winning move. Heather Reisman had founded Indigo Books and Music in 1997, building it deliberately as a smaller, more curated alternative to the superstore model Chapters had perfected. For years, Indigo expanded carefully, opening stores in select markets, competing directly with Chapters wherever the two chains overlapped, and absorbing losses that would have alarmed most retailers. What looked from the outside like a company struggling to keep pace with a much larger rival was, in hindsight, a company positioning itself for something else entirely. In the fall of 2000, Reisman made her move. Indigo launched a hostile takeover bid for Chapters, an attempt to acquire a company more than twice its size, at a moment when Chapters was already straining under supplier debt and a bruised public reputation. On paper, it should have been an impossible reach, a smaller money-losing chain attempting to swallow the dominant player in its own industry is not how these stories usually go. What made it possible was a single, carefully constructed argument placed in front of Canada's Competition Bureau. Any merger between the two largest bookstore chains in the country would normally invite serious antitrust scrutiny, and it did. Regulators raised real concerns that combining Chapters and Indigo would substantially reduce competition in English-language book retail, potentially pushing prices up and choices down for Canadian readers. Independent booksellers and some publishers argued the deal would entrench something close to a monopoly, giving the combined company outsized leverage over suppliers and shelf space alike. Indigo's answer to that objection was the twist that made the whole deal work. Rather than deny the market power concern outright, Reisman's side argued something almost the opposite, that Indigo itself was not a viable standalone business given the losses it had been sustaining, and that its only realistic path to survival was merging with the profitable Chapters chain. In effect, the argument for allowing two giants to combine was that one of them wasn't a giant at all. It was a company on the edge, and letting it merge was framed as a rescue rather than a consolidation of market power. On April 5, 2001, the Competition Bureau conditionally approved the merger. The company that had spent years positioning itself as the underdog had just won permission to acquire the chain that dominated the market it competed in. For the executives and shareholders on Chapter's side, the months that followed were a scramble few had prepared for. Larry Stevenson, the man who had built Chapters from a merger of Coles and Smith Books into the largest bookstore chain the country had ever seen, was now on the receiving end of exactly the kind of consolidation move he himself had once used to build his empire. In August 2001, shareholders of Chapters Inc. voted at their annual general meeting to approve the merger with Indigo. 2 months later, in October, minority shareholders in the separately structured Chapters Online voted by an overwhelming majority to accept a takeover as well. Piece by piece, the company Stevenson had spent 6 years building was being formally handed over. None of this happened in a vacuum that ordinary employees could see clearly while it was unfolding. Store managers who had spent years reporting up through Chapters' corporate structure now found themselves waiting for direction that came slower and less certain than usual. Publishing sales reps who had built relationships with Chapters' buying office over years now had to figure out almost overnight who they'd actually be negotiating with once the dust settled. For the people whose careers were built inside this company, the last months of 2000 and the first months of 2001 carried a particular kind of dread, the sense that something enormous was being decided above their heads, in rooms they'd never be invited into. What the merger actually did to the stores themselves became clear only after the paperwork was finished. Once Indigo completed its purchase of Chapters in early 2001, the new combined company began closing a number of Chapters locations that sat too close to existing Indigo stores. Redundancy the merger had been built to eliminate. In some cases, Coles and Smith Books locations were shuttered as well, whenever they overlapped too closely with a nearby Chapters site. The superstore chain that had spent years expanding into every market it could reach was now contracting, store by store, under new ownership that had no interest in running two competing versions of the same business in the same neighborhood. For employees at the locations that closed, the experience was blunt and specific. A store manager who had opened a location in the late 1990s, hired most of the original staff, and watched it become a fixture in its community, might now be told, with little warning, that the location no longer fit the combined company's footprint. Regulars who had shopped there for years would arrive one day to find a closing notice taped to the door. There was no dramatic bankruptcy announcement, no liquidation sale stretching across headlines. Just a quiet series of closures, one location at a time, each one a small loss inside a much larger story of corporate consolidation that most customers never fully registered as connected. The tone inside the surviving stores shifted too, gradually over the years that followed. Aesthetic differences between the Chapters and Indigo banners persisted for a while. Slightly different store layouts, different emphasis on non-book merchandise, but the distinctions blurred more with each passing year. Employees who had once identified proudly as Chapters people found themselves working for a company that increasingly spoke, thought, and marketed itself as Indigo first. There were harder edges to the new ownership as well, ones that had nothing to do with store closures or corporate structure. Under Reisman's leadership, decisions about what belonged on Indigo and Chapters shelves drew scrutiny that the original Chapters had rarely faced. Copies of Mein Kampf were pulled from shelves entirely, a decision that reignited debate about the line between responsible curation and censorship, given that the book still appeared on university and high school syllabi in historical contexts. Reisman and her husband, Jerry Schwartz, also drew controversy over their support for Israel through the Hiesig Foundation, which some critics argued bled into how the combined company was perceived by parts of its own customer base. These were not the kinds of controversies that would have followed the original, more business-focused Chapters. They were symptoms of a different company now sitting inside the old buildings. None of this was theft in any legal sense, and none of it violated the terms the Competition Bureau had approved. But something had clearly been extracted from what Chapters used to be. Not its assets exactly, but its identity as an independent institution that answered to its own name. The debt, the rushed expansion, the failed Pegasus venture, and the rivalry with Indigo hadn't just weakened Chapters financially. They had made it vulnerable to exactly the kind of takeover its own aggressive growth strategy had once been used to justify against smaller, independent bookstores years earlier. Who was really supposed to protect a national institution like this from being absorbed the moment its balance sheet showed weakness? The regulators who approved the deal, the executives who built the debt in the first place, or nobody at all, because that was simply how the industry chapters helped create was always going to work. There was no bankruptcy filing, no liquidation sale, no dramatic final day with cameras outside a flagship store. That was precisely what made the collapse of Chapters as an independent company so unsettling to watch. For the people who were paying attention, a company that had reshaped an entire industry didn't go out with a bang. It simply stopped being itself, one procedural step at a time, until the name on the door was the only thing left that hadn't changed. The first public sign came in the fall of 2000, when word of Indigo's takeover bid reached the press. For a company that had spent the previous year insisting, loudly and through legal action, that reports of its financial trouble were baseless, the sudden reality of a hostile takeover attempt landed as confirmation of exactly what it had been denying. Investors, publishers, and industry watchers who had taken Chapters at its word now had to reconcile that with headlines announcing a rival move to acquire the company outright. From there, the unraveling moved with startling speed. What had taken Chapters 6 years to build, from 2 superstores opening in November 1995 to a national chain of more than 70 locations, came apart administratively in roughly 6 months. The Competition Bureau's conditional approval landed on April 5, 2001. By August, shareholders of Chapters Inc. had voted at their annual general meeting to approve the merger. By October, minority shareholders of the separately structured Chapters Online had done the same. A company that had once been the undisputed face of Canadian bookselling no longer existed as an independent entity, and the entire process, from hostile bid to finalized takeover, had unfolded in less time than it takes to build a single new superstore from empty lot to grand opening. For employees, the experience of watching this happen depended enormously on where they worked. Staff at flagship locations in major cities mostly kept their jobs, absorbed into whatever the combined company would become. But for employees at Chapter superstores that happened to sit too close to an existing Indigo location, the outcome was blunter. Once the merger closed, the newly combined company began working through its overlapping footprint, closing Chapter stores that duplicated nearby Indigo locations, and in some cases shutting Kohl's or Smith Books locations for the same reason. There was no single announcement covering all of it. Instead, individual store managers in individual cities found themselves delivering the same basic news to their staff at different points over the following months. This location wasn't needed anymore. For the customers who had built weekend routines around a specific store, the change often arrived without ceremony. A family that had spent years bringing their kids to the same Chapters on Saturday mornings might simply find, one week, that the doors were locked and a notice was taped to the glass directing them to the nearest Indigo location instead. A store that looked similar, carried similar stock, but wasn't the place they'd actually built their memories inside. There was nothing to protest, nothing to mourn publicly. Just an inconvenience, absorbed quietly, by people who had no way of knowing they were living through the tail end of a takeover that had made national business headlines months earlier. Financially, the picture that emerged after the merger closed was sobering, even for a deal that had been approved as a rescue of the smaller company. In the fiscal year ending March 2002, the newly combined Indigo reported revenue climbing 7.2% to $735.5 million Canadian dollars. On paper, a company larger and stronger than either predecessor had been alone. But that same fiscal year closed with a loss of 47.9 million Canadian dollars. A stark reminder that folding 2 large, debt-strained retail operations into a single company doesn't erase the underlying problems overnight. Reisman herself described the company as roughly 12 months into a 2-year turnaround program, a candid acknowledgement that the hardest work of actually making the merger pay off was still ahead, not behind. The media coverage of the deal in the months surrounding its completion focused overwhelmingly on the business mechanics. Regulatory approval, shareholder votes, market share, antitrust concerns raised and conditionally resolved. There was little of the public mourning that typically accompanies the death of a beloved retail chain, Because in the strictest sense, nothing had died. The stores were still open. The books were still on the shelves. The coffee was still Starbucks. What had actually ended was harder to put into a headline. The idea of Chapters as something Canada owned and ran independently, on its own terms, answering to its own leadership and its own name. That distinction mattered enormously to the people who had spent years building the company. Larry Stevenson had enlisted David Peterson, a former Ontario premier, specifically to help Chapters navigate a country wary of foreign consolidation, swallowing up homegrown Canadian institutions. The irony was bitter. Chapters hadn't been lost to a foreign buyer or an American conglomerate, the threat Stevenson had spent years positioning the company against. It had been lost to a smaller Canadian rival that simply understood the regulatory landscape better and had been willing to lose money for years to set up the opening. For the sales floor employees who kept their jobs through the transition, the following years carried a specific, quiet erosion rather than a single dramatic ending. The Chapters name stayed on the buildings that survived the closures, but the internal culture, the marketing language, and eventually the visual branding all began shifting toward the parent company's identity. Staff who had once described themselves as working for Chapters increasingly found themselves describing their job as working for Indigo, the distinction blurring year over year until it barely registered as a distinction at all. By the time the dust from the merger had truly settled, the largest and most disruptive bookstore chain Canada had ever produced was still, technically, standing. The lights were on, the registers were ringing, but the company that Larry Stevenson had built out of two smaller chains, the one that had reshaped how an entire country thought about buying books, had ceased to exist as anything more than a name on a storefront and a banner in a larger portfolio. Something had been lost in that 6-month stretch between the hostile bid and the finalized takeover. Not a business exactly, but an independence that would never come back. What replaced Chapters in the end was Indigo. Not a competitor moving in from outside, but the company that had absorbed it from within. Over the years following the merger, the Indigo name gradually pulled ahead of Chapters on logos, marketing, and eventually in the public's own vocabulary. What had once been going to Chapters slowly became going to Indigo, even when the specific building a family walked into hadn't changed at all. The most visible casualty of that slow transition came in the spring of 2014, when Indigo closed 3 high-profile Toronto stores, among them the world's biggest bookstore. The 67,000-square-foot landmark that Chapters had once owned and proudly kept operating under its own storied name. Its closure meant more than the loss of retail square footage. It was the last physical piece of the old Chapters identity, the civic landmark tourists had once been told to visit alongside the CN Tower, quietly removed from the map nearly 2 decades after Chapters had first put it there. Around the same time, Reisman was candid about where the company was actually heading. In June 2014, she told the public that Indigo was moving into a new phase, one that would see a much higher percentage of its floor space and revenue coming from non-book merchandise, home decor, toys, gifts, the kinds of products that had nothing to do with the original vision Larry Stevenson had built Chapters around in 1995. The bookstore that had once been a temple for readers was, by the company's own admission, becoming something closer to a lifestyle retailer that happened to still sell books. The broader lesson for Canadian retail was harder to ignore with each passing year. Chapters had built its empire by outcompeting smaller, independent bookstores through scale, selection, and comfort. The very qualities that had made it beloved, but scale alone hadn't been enough to protect it from a smaller rival that understood regulatory leverage better than it understood retail competition. The company that mastered the old rules of Canadian bookselling had been undone by a rival that mastered a newer, quieter set of rules involving antitrust arguments and hostile takeovers. For an industry watching closely, the message was uncomfortable. Being the biggest and most loved wasn't the same as being safe. For the independent booksellers who had lost customers to Chapters throughout the 1990s, the merger and its aftermath offered a strange, complicated form of vindication. Some of the same critiques once leveled at Chapters, that it prioritized scale over community, that it was reshaping the industry in ways that served shareholders more than readers, were now being aimed at the very same superstores, just under new ownership. A handful of independent shops that had managed to survive the Chapters years by specializing in what no superstore chain could replicate found themselves still standing, long after the company that had once threatened to put them all out of business had ceased to exist under its own name. The years that followed brought further turbulence that had nothing to do with the original merger, but everything to do with the fragility it had exposed. Indigo faced a ransomware attack in February 2023 that crippled its ability to process transactions, returns, and gift cards for roughly 4 days, with its online store remaining unavailable for almost 2 months afterward. Reisman herself stepped down as CEO in September 2022, moving into an executive chair role after leading the company, in one form or another, for over 2 decades. And then, in April 2024, came perhaps the most fitting final chapter of all. Indigo, the company that had once cast itself as the underdog rescuing a doomed rival, agreed to be bought out and taken private by Trilogy Investments, ending its run as a publicly traded company altogether. What does it mean when the winner of a hostile takeover eventually gets absorbed by the very same market logic it once used to justify swallowing its rival? Chapters had disappeared into Indigo because it couldn't survive on its own terms. 2 decades later, Indigo disappeared from public markets for reasons that weren't entirely different. A business under pressure, restructured by forces larger than the people who had built it, its independence traded away for the sake of survival. Picture a Saturday afternoon in the late 1990s, inside a Chapters superstore somewhere in Canada. The light comes in through tall windows near the front registers. Somewhere past the new releases table, a kid is sitting cross-legged on the carpet with a stack of picture books nobody's asked her to buy yet. Near the coffee counter, a retired couple sits with 2 cups going lukewarm, 3 biographies split between them, in no hurry to decide which one to take home. The smell is coffee and new paper and carpet cleaner, a combination that belonged to no other store in the country. Nobody is being rushed. Nobody is being watched. For a few hours on a weekend afternoon, an ordinary bookstore in an ordinary Canadian city felt like it belonged to everyone who walked through the door, whether they spent a dollar or not. What Chapters offered in those years was never really about the books themselves. It was about permission to sit down in a public space and not be moved along, permission for a family with very little money to spend to still spend an entire afternoon somewhere that felt generous. Before Chapters, that kind of open invitation had mostly belonged to public libraries, not retail stores. Chapters borrowed that spirit and put it inside a business, and for a while, it worked in a way nobody had quite managed before in Canadian retail. It gave small towns and big cities alike a shared kind of gathering place, one where a teenager, a new parent, and a retiree could occupy the same room without any of them feeling out of place. That was the thing the merger with Indigo could never fully carry forward, no matter how many of the same shelves and the same coffee counters survived into the new company. An identity built by a specific company at a specific moment, answering to its own name, isn't something that transfers cleanly when the name changes hands. Chapters didn't just sell books. For a stretch of years, it gave the country a version of the public square, built out of paperbacks and armchairs, and that kind of thing is hard to replace once the company that built it stops being itself. Nobody set out to destroy Chapters, not Indigo, which was fighting for its own survival when it made its move. Not the publishers who tightened their terms when the debt became too visible to ignore. Not even Larry Stevenson, who built the company faster than it could always support its own weight, chasing a vision that, for a few years, gave an entire country something it had never had before. This isn't a story with a villain at the center of it. It's a story about how quickly something built to last can become something owned by someone else, and how much of what made it matter doesn't survive the transition, even when the building stays standing and the lights stay on. The people who worked those registers, who shelved those books, who spent their Saturday afternoons on that carpet, they gave Chapters its meaning, more than any executive or any merger ever could. That part was never for sale, and it's the part still worth remembering, long after the name stopped being its own.